Welcome, friends, to the very first episode of the Life in Motion podcast. I'm Pastor Kyle, joined with my good friend Phil Stevenson, and we want to talk about what's happening behind the scenes at Life Community Church. Stories of life change, things that we're discussing that we want to bring you into the conversation, and also just a time to learn and grow. Phil here is our resident expert on all things. We'll introduce him a little bit later. But we're so glad you're here. Our heart is to share the good things that God's doing behind the scenes in Life Community Church.
Hey, I was thinking, Kyle, we have two services, lots of people, lots of things going on, but sometimes something happens, a celebration, a great story that maybe some of us don't hear.
Yeah.
Do you have one of those you can share with us?
It's funny you talk about that. People see different things in different services. The one that comes to mind actually happened between services. A few weeks ago, I was preaching on sin, and if that isn't uncomfortable enough, I chose to talk about pornography because I think it's one of the most common sins and we don't talk enough about it. So I'm there in the first service, and there's these two people sitting in the front row, and all of a sudden they start to leave. I'm like, uh-oh, this is uncomfortable. But what made it more uncomfortable was the ushers then put this family in the front row because it was the only place available for all of them. Like, there's a new family with teenage boys sitting in the front row, and I'm talking about pornography.
Perfect.
This will be the first and last time I see them. And so after service, I ended up talking to them, and they just talked about how much they appreciated the honesty. And that dad said this. I looked at the two boys. I said, how much do you appreciate the honesty? And they just gave me that like blank adolescent stare. Like, I didn't like it, but if I say that, I'm going to get in trouble with my dad. And actually, I was having this great conversation with them, talking about how they talk about these hard things as a family and how much they resonated with it. And I just loving every minute. And then all of a sudden, in the corner of my eye, I saw something else happening. And I looked at this new family and I said, I'm so sorry, I've got to go. And they looked at me confused. I said, there's a baptism about to happen. And they're like, oh yeah, we totally understand. You see, what we had planned is to do baptisms in the first service as well as in the second service. But after the first service, there was someone who decided to get baptized, which is an amazing miracle all in itself. But because I knew the story, I just couldn't stay away. You see, there's a family in our church who God has called to foster kids, and they do like emergency short-term placements. So they foster about 25 kids, and it's been so difficult. I'm like, guys, what are you doing? But they're just like, God's calling us to do it. And I'm like, I agree, but it's so hard. And they had one placement who was with them, and they thought this could be a long-term thing. That kid ended up going to another placement, and they were sad, but they ended up coming back in, and it's becoming a long-term thing. But that 16-year-old girl, after that service, said, my life has so been transformed by Christ and through my experience living with this family that she asked this question, would it be okay if we got baptized? Would it be okay if you get baptized? That's like asking a pastor, would it be okay if we donated? Yes, that is what we want to do. And I think seeing stories like that remind me why I do what we do. And I really just want to encourage our church because there's so many good things that God is doing that by people investing their time, treasure, and talent, they don't get to see it, but I want to glorify God and also encourage our church because life really is in motion and God's doing amazing things, some that we are aware of and things that we're unaware of.
The thing I like about that story, not just that it was a baptism, which is in itself great enough.
Amen.
But yet the fact that as a church and you as a leader help this, we can go with God's surprises. You don't have to say, well, that's great. Well, you got to wait and then we'll baptize you. Instead of saying, no, we're going to do it right now in the celebration for her and for the church body. And even those folks kind of like, hey, we're having a baptism. And they go, oh yeah, that makes a big difference. So I think that's one of the highlights and the wonderfulnesses of Life Church.
Yeah, there's nothing better than baptism, the symbol of those who were dead in their sin, being alive with Christ and committing publicly to do it. Baptisms and life change is what we're all about. And while there's lots of different ways people experience life change, that's maybe the best demonstration of it.
Well, that is so true. And there's something else I want to bring up. I spent many years as a pastor. I preached a lot of sermons.
That's his way of saying he's old.
Absolutely. And so the thing I remember thinking after sermons, and no matter how I felt good they were in general, I'd walk off that platform and sometimes think, man, I should have said, if I could have done this or said this, that might have made all the difference. So actually having sat under your preaching ministry, I'm wondering, do you ever have moments like that where you said, man, I should have said that?
Every single Sunday. Sometimes it's because afterwards you're in a conversation and you're like, oh, I wish I would have said that for clarity. But what happens every week is when I dive into the research and the study, I'm learning all of these new things, and so many of them are exciting to me, and I want to share all of them. But we don't want to preach 45-minute sermons, and also not everything is either helpful or not everything can get the nuance that it needs on a Sunday morning. So like, here's an example. We just launched a series on Romans, and in our second series on Romans, there's this verse that's really stood out to me because I remember as a high school student, I was sitting with a student. Her name was Natalie. I remember we were in Mr. Clark's English class. Like I could remember it. And I was kind of known as the Jesus weirdo. And she's like, man, it seems like Christianity is so close-minded if you don't know Jesus. And she's like, what about the person born in Papua New Guinea who's never heard of Jesus? And I'm like, I want to show you this passage in Romans. And, you know, in Romans chapter 1, Paul has this statement. It says that since before the creation of the world, all of God's invisible qualities and characteristics have been made known to everyone so that all folks are without excuse. And I think what it does is it shows the heart of God that wants to reach out to everybody. And even it's not the closed-mindedness of God that says, hey, salvation through Christ alone. It's the openness of God that says, I want everyone to do it. And what I wanted to talk about was that question specifically, because I think other people have that question. There's a good question. Well, people have never heard of Jesus, and somehow mysteriously in ways that I don't understand, God reveals himself. But it's also this bigger principle, and this is more of a theology talk in this. It's this idea of general revelation versus specific revelation. Specific revelation is what most people think about, the miraculous way that God reveals himself through scripture, through Jesus, through miracles, or if you're one of our Catholic folks, you'd say through the church as well. Those are the specific revelations. But there's also this thing called general revelation. I think that's what Paul's talking about there, is that the world is ordered in such a way that people can see the mysterious complexity of the world and think, there's got to be a creator. There's order to it. I don't think it's a coincidence that the majority of moral codes more or less agree on the same thing. That even folks who don't know Jesus or the Christian scriptures also can see that there is truth that transcends, that unifies, that connects. And I think that's one of the things I love about God, wanting to reach other folks. But I also think for Christians to be thinking about there's general revelation and special revelation, and understanding the difference. We prioritize special revelation over general revelation, but at the same time, all truth is God's truth. And because God is a God of truth, at all times in all ways, he's trying to reveal truth to everyone.
And do you think that part of the reason that we kind of emphasize specific revelation is because if you go with general revelation and kind of leave it there, well, that opens up to, universalism. I think I got that right.
Yeah.
Just everything is God. God is in everything, which is true.
Yep.
But if you stay there, you don't have that connectional point with God that you can have.
Yeah, I do think it's the specifics of specific revelation that are helpful. I know that sounds like a joke or maybe even like a circular argument, but the specifics of specific revelation is very helpful. So for example, I talk to people who say, I believe in God, and God's a force, and God lives in all of us. And I'm like, you're half true there. But I think the specifics of Scripture say, yeah, we're all created in the image of God. But it's really when you become a Jesus follower that God lives inside of you. And I think what the Scriptures would say is that truth comes from the outside. Truth comes from God to us. And I think, again, some of the folks, apart from the specifics of Scripture, might say something like, I see God in everything, therefore I am God, God is inside of me. And you're like, yeah, you're half true. And I think that's where most of the lies live. Most of the lies live in the half truths that lack some of those specifics. And I also think we lean into specific revelation because it's the best and clearest that we have.
Right.
And I do think both are God's grace and gift to us. But yeah, I do think if we lean too much into general revelation, we become too us-centered and think we're smart enough to figure everything out. And I think that gets us off track.
Right. And I think that's a good reminder that as you preach and anybody speaks from the pulpit, it's about the whole gospel, not just bits and pieces of the gospel.
Yeah, yeah. So let's shift gears here, a little bit of learning. You've asked me some questions, but one of the things I love about our relationship is every time we get together, I'm asking you questions. For those of you who don't know Phil, Phil is a part of our church. He spent 40 years in church leadership. He's written over a half a dozen books. In his younger career, he worked for and was trained by John Maxwell, who's widely regarded as the #1 developer of leaders, or inarguably the #1 developer of Christian leaders in United States and North America. And I feel like it's such a gift to have him in our church, but also as a friend. And so every time we get together, I ask Phil questions. So this is the section I want to call Ask Phil. And if you have any questions, email the podcast at lifecconline.com, and we'll grill him, and you can ask him any question you want. And it's like you get to sit in my shoes and just enjoy his wisdom. So, Phil, here's my question for you today, because it deals with something I'm dealing with. When I was a youth pastor, I was kind of the adolescent whisperer. I was the expert on kids. And now I have a middle schooler who's, a tween is what you might call him. And he's a great kid. But I'm realizing that I felt like such an expert when I was a youth pastor. And now I often feel so inept as a parent. And here's the struggle for me. The struggle for me is trusting God in this area, because I've always wanted to trust my ability as a parent. And now I'm wrestling with that. How do I trust God in this new season? So I'm curious. I want to ask you, obviously you're an expert in leadership development, but what I think is maybe the best sign of your leadership development is you raised 3 kids who love Jesus, are productive members of society, and are a net win for the world around us. And so you are 3 for 3, which is amazing by anything. So I'm just curious, what would you say to me as a pastor, as someone who thought he was good, as someone who always wonders, am I doing enough or am I overdoing it? And what does it look like for me to trust God as a parent in this season of my life?
Well, I'll try my best to answer that question. I have the same background you did in youth ministry. And I can remember when I was a youth pastor, I would actually tell the parents, I can give you an insight into their world because they allow me into it. I'm not even going to pretend to try to tell you how best to do it as a parent, because at that time I didn't have a teenager. I remember when the realization came in and I did have teenagers, I thought, man, taking them home with you is a lot different than leaving them at the youth department of the church I was on staff at.
You were wiser than I was. I said some things about parenting before I had kids that I regret. So I wish I would have had you 10 years ago to protect me from myself. But go on. You're already showing your wisdom.
Well, I want to say this about parenting at all, is that it's a team sport. My wife and I she's incredible. In fact, when you said, "Oh, we'll ask Phil," I thought, well, if I don't know, I'll ask Joni, my wife, because she is one of the wisest people that I really do know. And so we saw it as a team sport. I can remember times where I would come home from work, and one of the kids was really going berserko, and my wife would literally say to me, I'm going to do the tag. And she slapped, and then she'd go in the bedroom. And I had to deal with all this stuff going on. But it was good. It was that way. But all that being said, here is what I think about that. When we are working with kids, whether you're a pastor or not a pastor, but you have kids, you have to look at what you do as not raising kids. You're raising young, responsible adults.
Yeah.
And when you look at it from that perspective, then everything that you do in the area of guidelines, discipline, whatever it might be, you're saying, I'm not just dealing with this one thing right here, right now.
Yeah.
I'm instead dealing with how to help them become responsible young adults. And that alleviates a little bit. But I will say one other thing specifically. to you as a pastor. And this is something actually a mentor of mine said to me when we were having kids, and he had already had kids. He was a pastor as well. He said, "Do not allow the church to put expectations on your children. They're your children, and they should be expected to be responsible, to be accountable, but they're not expected to be." He said, "You don't, for instance, expect a doctor's child to know how to remove an appendix because they just happen to be a child of a doctor." And so our kids as pastors, they're our kids, and they're not any more spiritual than any other kids at their age. And so it's free ourselves from expecting them to live under some kind of expectation of their church people. Now, what I think I observe about Life Church, that would never happen here. Yeah. I was fortunate in my ministry, never had kids say, "Well, how come your child did this? I thought they were a pastor's kid." And I never had that. So we had the freedom, and I think you have that freedom there. But even with that, sometimes we convince ourselves that people are expecting our kids to be some kind of a different level than other kids at their age.
I want you to go on, but I got to interrupt. I think this is one of those things that I've envisioned myself saying to our church a million times. So maybe this podcast is a great way. I've always wanted to say thank you to our church for letting my kids and my wife be my kids and my wife. When I got here, I was very clear about boundaries, especially about being home for bedtime and meals and not spending too many nights out. And I was afraid of what people would say, but I've been overwhelmingly encouraged. People saying, "We love that you are making that a priority." And there's people who probably don't like it and they just haven't said it. But this church has been so good to me. But I've always been afraid that if I went and said a big heartfelt thank you, people were just going to think I'm leaving the church, which I'm not. And so it's one of those thank yous that you get to say at the end that I now want to be able to say thank you to our church now for letting my family be my family, but also letting me be me. This church has been so, so good. But I want to get back to the parenting thing. You talked about you're not raising kids, you're raising young adults. Reminds me of Stephen Covey's "Begin with the end in mind."
Exactly.
So I want to ask you again, anything else you'd add there about parenting? Or another question I have is, obviously you or your wife did a great job parenting, but you've also, again, kind of your hallmark in ministry has been developing leaders. How would you compare and contrast the process of developing leaders versus developing kids?
I would actually say the principle remains the same. When you're developing leaders, you always have to ask yourself, what kind of leader do I want to develop? What kind of characteristics do I want to see in people who I'm developing as a leader? And then you develop or train towards that. I think too often in leadership development, we just say, well, we're going to develop leaders, instead of saying, oh, okay, but what kind of leader do you want to develop? What kind of characteristics do you want them to exhibit? If you don't know that, it's just like the phrase, if you don't know where you're going, any road will do.
Yeah.
And if you don't know what you're developing in leaders, then any material will do. But that's not what you want. You want a specific end result in mind.
It's interesting you talk about leadership development because we're in a season over the last 3 years where the church has grown numerically, which is awesome. But my biggest concern, my bigger concern as a pastor is not the rate at which we're growing numerically, but it's the rate at which we're growing spiritually, specifically for the leaders in our church. For us to be a healthy church, for us to develop disciples, we got to do not just see how many folks we can come, but how deep can we take them? And so that's one of the things that our leadership team has been thinking about, everything from small groups to one-on-one mentoring to launching more opportunities to develop leaders. And I think, if I'm not mistaken, you've been shoulder tapped by some of our staff, by Joy and Lori, to help rebrand, relaunch our leadership development pathway, which I'm very excited about. So on this last thing, this will be our last thing. What is it about leadership development that you've always been drawn to? Did you know it from an early age? Was it just natural and obvious? Did it take you a while to get there? How did that kind of become your lane or your calling card in ministry? Well,
for me, I think at some level there was kind of a natural bent towards that. I remember as a kid, like in elementary school, 6th grade, for some reason, I got tapped to be the president of the class. I know they don't do that stuff anymore, but it was like, okay, what was it? Looking back at the time, I didn't know that. What was it about what I was doing that was helpful? But really where it became a true passion for me was when I got on staff with John Maxwell.
Yeah.
And I had a PhD in leadership and didn't have to pay for it. I used to say they paid me to get that PhD. Now, I was a youth pastor, they didn't pay me much, but that's not the point. I ended up getting a great PhD in leadership. So watching John and watching how sincere he was and intentionally was about developing leaders, and then seeing the leaders and the lay leaders and even us as pastors grow, I thought that is so important. And I would even go to say that for us as a leadership group at Life Church is that developing leaders should be a priority. Obviously spiritual leaders, but the idea being that that's where the passion came from. I just saw great results, and I've kind of been, I guess, addicted ever since.
Yeah. It's amazing having this conversation. Honestly, even if no one listens to this podcast, if I just get to hang out with you twice a month and ask you questions, it's
well,
for sure worth it to me. The second goal would be, how long have you been part of the church now?
Really only actually actively a part of the church since I retired about 14 months ago.
It's about 14 months ago. And in 14 months, he's preached, he's been on this podcast, and he still doesn't know the name is Life Community Church and not Life Church. So maybe he'll learn that along the way. But in more sincerity, my heart, again, I want to say thank you to those of you who have listened all the way. If you've made it this far, you are a rare and few and wonderful group. But we hope that you tune in every other week to Life in Motion as we celebrate the good things God is doing, try to grow as followers of Christ, and really continue to build this community of connection who are connected to this mission to help lead folks to a life-changing relationship with Jesus Christ. If you have any questions or suggestions, please email podcast@lifecconline.com. And if this was a blessing to you, please bless us back. Please share this with someone who you think might appreciate it. And tune back 2 weeks from now, and we'll see what the podcast becomes. Thanks for joining us on this journey. We love you. I love being your pastor. See you soon.